a todos a retomar sus asientos, por favor. Vamos a iniciar o retomar el foro con el panel número 3. El siguiente panel se titula Opportunities for Improvement of the Maritime Labour Convention in the Protection of LGBTIQ Employees. Invitamos cordialmente a todos a retomar sus asientos para escuchar a los panelistas del panel número 3. Muchas gracias a todos. Les recordamos a todos los asistentes que están cordialmente invitados a la exposición artística de IXIS2 2023, misma que se titula Invisibles y que presenta obras de Milena Sanas, Nicanor Monroy y Gavich, bajo la curaduría de la artista panameña María Gabriela Herrera. Ahora retomamos este primer foro internacional de IXIS2 2023 con el tercer panel. Como les comentaba, se titula Opportunities to Improvement of the Maritime Labour Convention in the Protection of the LGBTIQ Employees. La moderadora de este panel es Anamae Ortiz. Les cuento un poco sobre ella. Anamae es abogada con amplia experiencia en leyes y reglamentos del sector marítimo, también en el registro de buques panameño. Es experta en colaboraciones en la Autoridad Marítima de Panamá y la Autoridad de Recursos Acuáticos de Panamá. Anamae es socia del bufet de Castro y Robles y secretaria de la Asociación Panameña de Derecho Marítimo, APADEMAR. Con un cálido aplauso recibimos a Anamae Ortiz.
Hello, thank you all. I am very honored to be moderating this panel that I am very sure will give very interesting insight on several aspects. This panel aims to improve the safety, protection, and recognition of the rights of LGBTIQ+ people in the maritime sector through a legal framework that guarantees full inclusion, fair treatment, equity, and a safer industry for all. The panel seeks to address the current limitations of the Maritime Labour Convention and to promote concrete solutions to these limitations. I am glad to introduce the panelists as follows. Agnes Nauwelaerts is a senior legal advisor at the Directorate-General-Shipping at Federal Public Service Mobility and Transport since 2011. She started working at DGS after having obtained a master's in law, University of Antwerp, and a master's in international relations and diplomacy, University of Antwerp and University of Copenhagen. Specialized subjects are the MLC Convention, the Human Element, Insurance Conventions, Certification, and Maritime Legal and Policy questions in general. She represents Belgium in several committees of the International Maritime Organization, including the Legal Committee as head of delegation, Technical Cooperation Committee and Council, and is also head of delegation for ILO meetings related to MLC. Please help me welcome Ms. Agnes. Our next panelist is Dr. Khanssa Lagdami. Khanssa Lagdami is the ITF Seafarers Trust Assistant Professor of Maritime Labor Law and Policy at the World Maritime University. Her strengths lie in maritime labor law, the future of work in the maritime sector, and maritime security. She is currently involved in significant research projects on the impact of new and emerging technologies on seafarers. Dr. Lagdami is also the academic coordinator of the Maritime Welfare Program at WMU, which is a professional development program that delivers a comprehensive overview of topics and issues related to the seafarer welfare. bringing together world-leading experts on seafarer rights, maritime regulations, and welfare issues. Dr. Lagdami holds a PhD in maritime law from Nantes University and a Master in Maritime Management Affairs from University of Perpignan in France. Please help me welcome Dr. Khanssa Lagdami. And finally, please let me welcome Ms. Laura Carballo Pinheiro. Professor Carballo Pinheiro teaches private international law at the University of Vigo, where she has also been appointed Dean of the newly created Faculty of International Relations. Prior to joining the University of Vigo, she worked at the World Maritime University, where she was the holder of the Nippon Foundation Chair of Maritime Labor Law and Policy, an associate professor at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. She is admitted to practice as a lawyer and has worked as a deputy judge in Spain. Her areas of expertise include private international law, international litigation, international insolvency, and maritime law. As a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, she has specialized in international maritime labor law, being her research published in 2015 by Springer at the Hamburg Studies on Maritime Affairs collection, edited by the International Max Planck Research School for Maritime Affairs at the Hamburg University. She has cooperated with different UN agencies, including the International Labour Organization, the International Maritime Organization, the United Nations Commission on International Trade, UNCITRAL, and the UN Agency for Food and Agriculture. Professor Carballo has published in a number of international journals in English, German, Italian, and Spanish. She has been visiting fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative and Private International Law, Columbia Law School, the Institute of European and Comparative Law at Oxford University and UNCITRAL, and she has been visiting professor in a number of institutions in Europe and Latin America, such as the Hague Academy of International Law, the Central European University, the Universities of Antioquia and Medellin in Colombia, and the Central University of Venezuela. Please help me welcome Dr. Carballo. Well, panelists, thank you all for agreeing to join us here. As you all know, our panel is the opportunities for improvement of the Maritime Labour Convention in the protection of LGBTIQ+ employees. This panel has been divided in three main objectives. The first main objective is to evaluate and analyze the Maritime Labour Convention in terms of its scope to ensure the rights and working conditions of seafarers worldwide, particularly LGBTIQ+ individuals, identifying its current limitations and challenges. In order to address this specific objective, I will ask some questions to our panelists. So let's begin. Dr. Lagdami, in what aspect would the Maritime Labour Convention limit the rights and inclusion of the LGBTIQ+ community in the maritime sector?
First, let me start by thanking the organizers and Gustavo for the invitation. I'm very proud to be here and to be part of this event, and I hope that it's just the start and that you will continue to organize forums like that, maybe annually and maybe in other parts of the world. I want also start by saying or underlying what other colleagues said before me, that the maritime sector is not an easy sector. Not at sea, not on shore. So even in the academia, and where we maybe a lot of us working in the maritime sector, when you are working with people coming with a background for, a seafaring background, it's not easy. It's not easy for women as well in this sector. So adding to that, and the pressure that you got, adding to that you have to try to protect yourself because of your sexual orientation or your gender identity. So I think the pressure is too much to take. So it's time also to start the discussions about that, and I'm very thankful that you have asked me to intervene on this topic, and especially the MLC. So as a general overview as regards to the MLC, the Maritime Labour Convention, developed by the International Labour Organization, the instrument doesn't really tackle the issue of the LGBTQ+ explicitly. In the entire instrument, there is no mention about the LGBTQ+ community, or even about any aspects related to sexual orientation or gender identity. So I think those are some aspects that we start just lately to highlight and to bring up to the table. And this morning we have seen with our friends from the ITF that there is a lot of work that is ongoing with the help of ITF and ICS as well. And of course, there is some guidelines that they have been developed, but it's still not enough. The instrument doesn't tackle any of the issues related to the LGBT community. But I can, more specifically, I can give some details about what I mean that there is nothing about it. So the MLC does not explicitly recognize sexual orientation and gender identity as protected characteristics for seafarers. So this omission means that the LGBTQ+ individuals may not receive specific legal protection when they are discriminated or when they are subject to harassment and etc. Also, there is a lack of anti-discrimination in general provisions, and this include also women. So the MLC does not include provisions that explicitly prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And without clear protection in place, the LGBTQ+ persons in the maritime sector may face unequal treatment or be subject to discrimination practices without, of course, legal recourse. There is also an absence of inclusive policies and benefits. So the MLC doesn't even invite member that they ratified the instrument to develop inclusive policies. We are not yet here in terms of the MLC. There is also limited reporting aspect in the convention. We have some provisions as regards to the reporting, and in 2019 the MLC, the ITF and ICS they developed some guidelines. In 2022 the conventions had some amendments as regards to sexual harassment, but again, it doesn't include, or it doesn't give specificity as regards to the LGBTQ+ persons. And then, of course, as has been mentioned several times, there is a lack concerning the awareness and the training, meaning that there is a lot of things to be done. I'm sure that this kind of forums that might help out to bring to the, to the discussions that those issues should be included in a legal instrument like the MLC, which is the minimum standards for seafarers. This instrument has been developed to give to seafarers the minimum protection, but it still needs a lot of aspects to include. Thank you.
Thank you, Khanssa. Laura, do you have something you want to add to what Khanssa has said?
Thank you so much, Anamae. Thank you so much to Gustavo and to all the organizers for having me here. It is really a honor to be here and to be accompanied by these splendid women, all of them. So yes, I would like to start remarking, like it was already said in the previous panel, that the MLC is operating in a very challenging environment because, I mean, it is operating worldwide. And in the previous panels, it was pointed out some national developments as regard to the protection of the LGBTQI+ communities. But they are national developments that take a lot of effort, a lot of travel to put them on the black letter of the law. They take much more effort when it comes to their enforcement, when you go to the part of the application, that's not easy yet, and they are still challenged. So imagine that when we go on board a ship, which is a multicultural environment, the people on board are bringing not only their laws with them, but also social and gender norms that are colliding to each other. So the Maritime Labour Convention tries to put some order, so to say, or at least to level the playing field. And in that regard, it's a consolidated, as we know, as consolidated Maritime Labour Convention that has been achieved through many compromises. And one of those was not to discuss the critical points like these ones, and that's why discrimination is, well, discrimination is in the convention, but it's not developed, because discrimination is both in the preamble of the convention and is also on the Article 4 of the convention. There is a reminder of the fundamental principles and rights at work, because it's good to remember that the 1998 Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work is applicable to all member states to the ILO, and that means that all those countries that have a fleet, they need to apply the elimination of discrimination, and that means that they also need to tackle with this new type of discrimination, because that's also new. In the international conventions, apart from the 1998 declaration, we have reference to discrimination on grounds of sex, but there is not a clear reference to sexuality or gender, or the discriminations on the basis of gender equality or gender expression or sexual appearances, identification, and so on. So that's an extra challenge, because then we need to go to the national framework also to see how they have framed discrimination. And it is more and more agreed that discrimination grounds of sex includes also this type of discrimination against the LGBTQI+ community. But for example, in the United States, where they have a lot of discussions, and the issue, for example, of sexual harassment was expressed, in the United States, it was not until 2018 when the US Supreme Court said that discrimination on grounds of sex included this type of discrimination, just to give an example of the challenges we have. So the reference in the MLC means that all that framework should be applicable on board. The problem is that all these conventions need to be operationalized, and there we have clearly a challenge. The convention does make some references to how this prohibition on grounds of discrimination should be, or prohibition of discrimination should be implemented, but it is also to highlight that those references are only on the guidelines of the convention. The convention is divided in standards and guidelines. The standards are hard law, guidelines are soft law, are guidance. Of course, when they are adopted by national implementation, they become mandatory. But the point is that a key issue like the principle of equal treatment at work, and that goes basically to the principle of equal pay for equal work, is only expressed in a guideline, and the reference is to sex. So maybe it would be good that the convention, as Khanssa was mentioning, is more specific, is more specific, and refers not only to sex, but also to gender identity and so on. That should not be discrimination on these grounds either. Another reference is on the guideline, referencing to accommodation that needs to be provided to seafarers when they have access to shore-based facilities, or the issue of data collection but recruitment and placement services. And that's a point that also that we need to work in, because there is clearly a lot of lack of transparency on how the provisions of the MLC are being applied. And when there is lack of transparency, when we are talking about employment relationships, that means that discrimination can sneak in, of course. So.
Well, thank you, Laura. I see that you've also, in your exposition, you've not only addressed in what aspect it limits, but the same as Khanssa, you've also mentioned opportunities for improvement. So before I give Agnes the opportunity, then I would, to comment on this previous question, I would also like to raise the following question. Since we're already discussing in what aspects does the Maritime Labour Convention limit the rights of inclusions, we would also like to know what are the current opportunities for improvement of the MLC regarding diversity and inclusion, especially in terms of protecting the LGBTIQ plus community. Agnes, please.
Yes, I think from a Belgian perspective, our anti-discrimination laws are extremely broad, like sexual orientation, gender expression, sex change, that's all included, and you cannot discriminate based on that. An employer cannot ask you about that. It's very broad, and if you have a complaint, then people can literally be sent to jail for inciting to discrimination. So from our perspective, if there's something mentioned about discrimination in the MLC convention, we see that with our perspective, and it's like, that's all included for us. But then on the other side, we're also a port state, and a very large port state. So if there are complaints coming in our ports, we need to be prepared for that, and we need to leave our national framework behind and look at the international framework, being the MLC. And as Khanssa and Laura have already mentioned, there is something missing there, because LGBT is not mentioned at all, and if we get a complaint, there's not so much we can do as a port state, because the MLC has its limit, and we need to stick to the MLC framework when doing port state controls. But to get back a little on the Belgian perspective, it's we have several laws on anti-discrimination, and recently we also added a law that is specifically directed to the social partners, so representatives from seafarer and ship owners organizations. They would need to report to the government on how they're tackling diversity, what they are doing, and that's every 2 years. And if the government decides, well, you're not doing enough, then they have to come up with an action plan. So it's not just when someone has a complaint, then the government comes into action. It's really, we're expecting a proactive attitude from all sectors, including the maritime sector. And if there's room for improvement, I think if we look at the practicalities of it all, and something our ship owners have also mentioned, it's the sanitation facilities. The MLC explicitly states that there needs to be separate facilities for women and men. And in our view, that would be a problem for people that don't identify as male or female, and that would be a discrimination. And our ship owners have already responded to that, and they said, well, most of our ships, each seafarer has their own cabin, they have their own toilet, they have their own shower. So just from a practical point of view, they already are actively doing something to prevent that and to be inclusive for everyone, even if it's not explicitly mentioned. Because when we asked our ship owners, their general reaction was, yeah, so what? There are gay seafarers on board our ships, but it doesn't matter. And I think that's really the Belgian perspective there, that it's so normal for us that we don't even think about it. But yeah, they also acknowledge that maybe there could be some guidelines or some policies that would be very helpful. But in general, it's not like it's perfect in Belgium, but it's the norm. It's normal. Like gay people in the workplace, it's not. If you make a problem of it, that would be strange.
Well, that's good news. I think we should all follow Belgium's example. All right, to continue with our objectives, we have then the second objective, which is to identify and promote concrete solutions to address the limitations of the MLC regarding inclusion and diversity of human talent, fostering cooperation among employers, governments, and unions to improve working conditions and safety in the maritime sector. So basically, and yes, you've already sort of answered this question already, because I understood from what you said that ship owners in Belgium are already responding to said problems. So then I would like to hear Khanssa's and Laura's thoughts on how can employers, governments, and unions promote greater cooperation to explore potential solutions to the limitations of the MLC.
Briefly, I think the first thing is to promote dialogue, okay, between all stakeholders, including the employers, the seafarers, the unions. So this is very important, and I'm pretty sure there is already some discussions. But also to share best practices, and I think Anis was sharing with us how it works in Belgium, and I think it's very good also to see how it works in other parts of the world. I think the Scandinavian, and as we are based in Malmö in Sweden, I think every day we see how the country is treating the LGBTQ plus community and how they are well protected at workplaces. And I think it's really good to get some view about best practices, not only in the maritime, maybe in other sectors as well, to see how it works. And of course, I think it's really good to involve the LGBTQ plus organizations, because sometimes we are not really clear about the issues that the community is facing. And I think it's time to include the organizations in the discussions with all of that, because you can't bring legal instruments without the people themselves. Okay, I mean, here we are discussing about seafarers, but we have also to highlight that sometimes people, they don't like to talk about their sexual orientation, because maybe they will be judged. Maybe I myself had a lot of interviews with seafarers on some ships, and a lot of them coming from some countries, they are scared to lose their jobs. They are scared that the ship owner will know something, let's say, as regards to their anxiety or stress, for instance. They don't, even about the harassment, I ask so many of them, have you faced any harassment incidents? They will say no. And then I had another question saying, have you learned or heard about another colleague of you who has an harassment incident? They will say yes. So it was like a very, very interesting, responses that I get. So I think to include the community in the discussions, it's very important.
Laura, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you, because this is really key to improving the rights of the LGBTIQ plus community and in general workers. And that's one of the potentials of the Maritime Labour Convention that, well, I have already talked about the pointed out the challenges that it faces because it's a global convention. It has to deal with different mentalities, but it has also said that inside the convention, the potential for social dialogue, because we have the special tripartite committee there managing the amendments to the Maritime Labour Convention, bringing tripartism to the core of the convention. The answer would be to your question, actually, that the convention itself set up the possibility for a global social dialogue, while promoting national social dialogue. So in national communities, there should be this tripartism also, while implementing the convention, while reforming, they can discuss these topics, but that can be done also at global level. And for me, that's the interesting part, because then you can overcome the national mentalities. What you cannot achieve at a national level, because it's very difficult also to have strong social partners in many communities. That's another point, that you need to increase inclusivity also within social partners. So for me, it's critical to have the LGBTQI+ voices inside, especially the trade unions, and if possible, also to the ship owners organization, and that can be done. There are many studies that are indicating that if women and the LGBTI+ community is not within the social partners, the voices, then these topics are not brought to the negotiating table. So it's critical to have them. But bringing these topics to the ILO it would be a wonderful way to overcome many resistances. I'm not saying that it's an easy path, because we have already heard this morning that many countries even punish with the death penalty consensual sex among people of the same gender, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be difficult, but it is in the convention, and that can be done because there are many contradictions at national level. That would be a wonderful way to overcome what's going on at sea, the type of discrimination that's going on at sea. So one way would be to bring the dialogue to the special tripartite committee. And another way is to deal with the provisions of the convention. First, we were talking about a rights-based approach, the prohibition of discrimination, how it should be implemented, but then there is also the positive approach to these issues, because when we discuss about the empowering the LGBTQI+ community, we are also talking about occupational safety and health matters. And the convention does address at length the possibility of developing policies and programs that work with this approach, which is critical for empowering the community, the worker safety approach, which is much more fruitful because it's not about putting something on a law that afterwards cannot be applied. The rules have to be alive to be applied. So there has to be a consensus, and that consensus has to be it's a work in progress, as we all know. It has to be done inside the ship and inside the company. The company with the social dialogue that Khanssa was talking about. The convention brings us that possibility, and that's why we have the 2018 amendments discussing bullying and the 2016, sorry, the bullying and harassment included within the convention, but it's not only bullying and harassment, of course, it's much more, because we need to prevent, not just to report or whatever, we need another type of game-changing mentality. And the convention also establishes the possibility or orders the possibility of having safety committees on board. So it's not just the management, the captain, bringing on board this type of policies, a zero tolerance policy, for example, against bullying and harassment, but it's also the safety committee and bringing the voice, for example, or training someone on board, like a responsible employee, that can take a look at what is going on board, that is sufficiently trained to detect this type of discrimination.
Thank you, Laura. We're going to go on to the next question because we are running out of time, regretfully. This is a very interesting subject and we have much to say about it. So I would like to discuss now, how can maritime companies promote and uphold the rights of the LGBTIQ plus community, given these existing gaps that you have mentioned in the MLC protection of the community? How do you feel that the companies can promote and uphold the rights? What can they do for that? Would you like to?
First of all, I forgot before, but I want to also thank the organization and Gustavo for giving me this opportunity, and it's an honor to be surrounded by all these amazing people here. As for the question, I forgot the question. Sorry.
Well, you sort of answered that with your comments in Belgium of ship owners. How can the maritime companies promote and uphold the rights of the LGBTIQ plus community, given these gaps that exist with the MLC?
I think because our ship owners' response was so positive and like, yeah, there's no problem here, but they could be more vocal about that. They could, as the management, just say that out loud, say that explicitly, that they support LGBTIQ plus in the maritime. This should also start within the Maritime Academy already, that even from an education point of view, that when you start your education, you know that you're going to be welcome on board a ship. And I think employers would have a very big role in making it clear to everyone that they accept LGBTIQ plus people on board their ships and that they're all welcome. And I think that's the first step that they need to take, is to be explicit about their support.
Thank you. Khanssa, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about the support that ship owners should give to the LGBTQ plus community. It's very important. Of course, as we said, since this morning, seafaring work is not easy for everyone. So I think all seafarers need support, but there is much needed for the LGBTQ plus individuals. There is the support. There is also that ship owners should develop as a companies, individual companies, policies, anti-discrimination towards the community. I'm pretty sure that there is some ship owners that they are doing the effort, but it's not enough, and maybe there is the role also of the unions to play a role, between seafarers and the ship owners, and to build up, let's say, a good basic for some guidelines for ship owners. Of course, as we mentioned before, there is ICS and ITF that they have been working closely on this matter, but even as individuals, companies, they should develop something like that. But the most important is the implementation. It's good to implement, to develop guidelines. It's good to develop policies, but companies, they have to do the effort to implement those policies and those guidelines, and more importantly, to give the rights and to give the space also. We have to say the space to seafarers to express themselves, and when there is something wrong, they can express themselves freely without, fear or anything like that. I think also maybe to do some audits. I was thinking about it this morning, how we can really implement that. So maybe at the end of the implementation, the ship owners can apply some audits, or maybe through the MLC, when we are talking about all the amendments that the MLC needs. So maybe we can talk also about some audits in that matters.
Thank you. Laura, is there something you would like to add?
Yeah,
We have one
I mean-
final question, so if you want to.
Okay. Yeah, but I wanted to say that there is a lot of potential within the Maritime Labour Convention, and that potential needs to be developed, especially by ship owners. I've already mentioned that there is lack of transparency in the sector, and that is clearly affecting how people get hired, how people get recruited, promoted, trained, emoluments, etc., etc., etc. So we need to work on that. Meaning that we need to work, for example, just is one of the examples. The convention is just setting up a very minimum standards. Those minimum standards need to be developed by national legislation, but nevertheless they can be also improved by the ship owners themselves, taking upon themselves to improve that part. And I'm just going to give an example. Khanssa and me were working together for the European Commission in one study on social dumping in the sectors. And one of the things that we realized and we were asking was how much the crew costs to you, labor costs. It was impossible. I mean, Khanssa was putting the question, it was impossible to know. And that's critical. Pay transparency is critical. We need to provide, they need to provide when they are recruiting people, gender-neutral job vacancies. I mean, no discrimination in that regard, and informing clearly people how much they are going to earn, and afterwards also learning them how they are going to be promoted and how they are going to be paid along their career based on their qualifications, their efforts, their responsibility. I mean, objective criteria that can be measured up. And that's something very simple, extremely complicated according to ship owners, but very simple that would immensely help, of course, not only the LGBTIQ plus community, but to all us. And that's an approach that we need to make and to take. And in that regard, it would be a wonderful way to tackle a critical issue.
Well, perhaps you would also like to address our final question, which is what international agreements can we identify as good practices for protecting LGBTIQ plus employees and serve as a platform to improve the MLC?
Yeah, well, I think that through the panel, the three of us, we have been distinguishing, on the one hand, this right-based approach, so we will have all the international human rights framework related to discrimination that could be also taking us as an inspiration, not talking about the big conventions, but those that are going into the details about which policies a country should take in order to avoid discrimination. And then the positive approach, so to say, the worker safety approach that it will help us to really spell out the information, consultation, and participation rights of seafarers. So that's one approach that we can take in order to avoid discrimination in the end and work together within the sector. As an inspiration, for example, the European Union is doing very interesting work spelling out this type of issues. And you can see that although it's a very close, I mean, culturally is diverse, but at the same time is closer than the rest of the world, there are lots of tension within the European Union, also when it comes to the protection, of course, of LGBTQI plus community that is reflected in the legislation of the European Union. But if we take the protections from the point of view of the employee, protection it is much easier to come to an understanding, to an agreement about which particular problems we would need to tackle. And one of them is equal treatment, the principle of equal pay for equal work, which is clearly challenging when it comes to maritime. That would be one issue. Another issue that I wanted to mention is the issue of data collection. We need to increase that. In the last amendments, for example, to the Maritime Labour Convention was already mentioned because, for example, Australia was putting forward the need to get more information about suicides on board. Okay. Mental health was also on the agenda, which is also important from the worker safety protection, but especially when you are bullied and harassed. So there's also a framework there that we need to take into consideration to protect the LGBTIQ+ community.
Well, thank you. It seems that our time is up. So before I conclude, I would like to thank all of these three remarkable women that have shared their experiences with us. And well, we know that the maritime industry is not an easy industry. We all of us who work at this industry, we know this very well. It is not an industry that is easy to get into, especially being a woman, and now even more so complicated for the LGBTIQ+ community. I gather from all of your interventions that some of the issues that affect the MLC is that it does not tackle the issue of the LGBTIQ+ community, does not recognize sexual orientation, gender identity as protected characteristics for seafarers, and does not include a protection for harassment. There is an absence of inclusive policies. The amendments to the sexual harassment do not really make reference to the LGBT community. And you also mentioned that discrimination is addressed but not really developed. So all of you suggest basically key issues of equal treatment at work that are currently only expressed in guidelines, but you believe they should be included as standards or regulations. We know that you consider that the convention refers to sex and gender. It should be better, more inclusive, improve on issues as to accommodations, perhaps following standards brought forth by Belgium. We should take their example, separate accommodation for men and women. Also promote dialogue between seafarers and unions, share best practices, which are not only related to maritime, but other sectors. Provide more clarity on the issues that the LGBTIQ+ community is facing and include them in the discussions. You also suggested raising the issue before the LIO and bringing the dialogue before the special tripartite committee. So I would like to thank you once again for all your recommendations and your participation in this panel, which has been very enlightening, and I would like to thank you all for your attention.
If just I may, I just wanted to remind you about fishers, because it's also the Working Fishing Convention, so for the next forum I would like to ask to include that part as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todas las panelistas de este panel número 3. El comité organizador de esta conferencia desea hacer entrega de un reconocimiento a los miembros de este panel y para ello invitamos a Abraham Rodríguez y David Hordern, voluntarios de AXIS2, para la entrega de estos. A la señora Agnès Nauwelaerts. A la doctora Khanssa Lagdami. A la doctora Laura Carballo Piñeiro. Y a la moderadora, la señora Anamae Ortiz. Invitamos a todas las panelistas y a los voluntarios, por favor, para la fotografía oficial del panel. Sí, como deseen. Un fuerte aplauso para el panel 3, por favor.